Madam President, I rise to speak on S-954, the legislation to reauthorize agricultural programs. As a former chairman and ranking member of the Agriculture Committee, I recognize how difficult it is to combine all the diverse interests into a single piece of legislation that meets the needs of all crops, all regions, and all rural and urban communities that the Farm Bill impacts. I want to thank Chairwoman Stabenow and Ranking Member Cochran for their work that they have done to craft a reform-minded bill that not only saves $24 billion with sequestration cuts included, but also provides an effective safety net for farmers and ranchers all across the country to rely on in times of need. This bill embodies reform, streamlining, and consolidation, and with the biggest issue facing our country today being our growing debt and deficit, I commend the members of the Agriculture Committee for stepping up and doing the work necessary to find savings. While we take these essential steps, we must also do it in an equitable and a fair manner. Agriculture producers face a combination of challenges such as unpredictable weather, variable input costs, and market volatility that all combine to determine profit or loss in any given year. The 2008 Farm Bill provided a strong safety net for producers, and successor legislation must adhere to and honor the same commitment we made 5 years ago. It is also important to note that this bill must not only work to protect producers in times of need, but it must responsibly serve as a nation's safety net for the nutritional well-being of low-income Americans. Last year, when we went through this process, I was unable to support the bill. However, I appreciate the chairwoman and ranking member for making improvements to last year's bill. While the bill before us is not perfect, I believe that everyone who is involved in agriculture understands that it addresses the needs of U.S. agriculture, which is what the policy coming out of this body should address. While I understand there are different ideas about what safety net is best, I urge my colleagues to recognize that one program doesn't work for all crops. The bill before us attempts to provide producers with options to find what works best for them, and that is a step in the right direction. A new program, known as the Adverse Market Protection, seeks to serve the needs of those who are not protected by the agriculture risk coverage and crop insurance programs. It is imperative that the farm safety net provide protection for multi-year declines, especially for southern crops like rice and peanuts, since the protection provided by ARC and crop insurance is not sufficient. Also, I would like to recognize that the upland cotton policies contained in the chairwoman's mark represent fundamental reform in the support provided to cotton farmers, reforms that contribute $2.8 billion towards savings in the committee's budget target. The legislation eliminates or changes all Title I programs, providing direct support to those involved in cotton production, and puts us down the path to resolving our WTO dispute with Brazil. Further, I would like to express my support for a provision in this bill that ties conservation compliance to crop insurance. My amendment last year on the floor relinked the two, and since then, 32 leading agriculture, conservation, and crop insurance groups have come to support this provision and have come together with ideas to form a compromise on details of this linkage. The compromise will provide a strong safety net for our farmers and natural resources while allowing them to be wise stewards of the taxpayer resources. And for those of us who enjoy hunting and fishing in the outdoors, this provision will provide for future generations of Americans the same opportunity that we have to hunt and fish today. There's another provision that did not come up in the discussion in the Ag Committee that I want to just briefly comment on, and that's the dairy program. The dairy program is always an integral part of every farm bill, and I'm not anywhere near an expert on the dairy program. In fact, I kind of leave that to states that have a more significant, where it has a more significant impact. But in my state, when I came to Congress almost 20 years ago, we had in excess of 700 dairies in Georgia. Today, we have less than 300. In fact, it's closer to 250. And I don't know what the problem is, but I do think as we move this bill off the floor and into conference, particularly with what's been going on in the House relative to dairy and the discussion over there, that we need to be mindful of the fact that we need to address this program long term. If the way it's designed now is the best we can do, so be it. But I do think that it's going to merit a significant discussion on dairy once we get to conference and have our ideas shared with the House and the House's ideas shared with us. This will be my fourth and final farm bill as a member of Congress. And as a member of the Ag Committee and as a strong supporter of Georgia agriculture for my nearly 20 years in Congress, I've witnessed several disputes, especially regional disputes. However, I am confident that we can balance the needs and interests between commodities and regions to reach our common goal of getting a farm bill across the line. Ultimately, the reason we are here is to represent those who work the land each and every day to provide the highest quality agricultural products and the safest agricultural products of any country in the world. We have the opportunity to write a bill that is equal to their commitment to provide food, feed, and fiber that allows America to be the greatest nation on earth. Madam President, I thank you, and I look forward to the forthcoming debate on the remaining amendments, and I would yield the floor.
Okay. Madam President?
The senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I came here today, first of all, to talk about the Farm Bill. I'm a member of the Agriculture Committee. We're very proud of this bill. It's a strong bill. And as Senator Chambliss just pointed out, it enjoys broad bipartisan support. Of particular importance to the state of Minnesota is the safety net that's in that bill. The focus on ag research, which, as you know from the state of Wisconsin, is very important with your great universities. The work that we have done with dairy and trying to improve the dairy program. The dairy farmers have been the hardest hit in our state of any of the agriculture groups. I've done some new things for new and beginning farmers. And then, of course, the sugar program, something that's been a topic today as there are some of our colleagues are trying to strip the sugar program out of the bill. I would argue this is 30,000 jobs in the Red River Valley of Minnesota and North Dakota. American sugar is actually much less expensive than you see as a price on the global marketplace. The sugar program works. It works for workers. It works for America, and we need to continue it. So with that, I'd like to turn to the focus of my remarks today, which is first of all on the budget. I want to thank Senator Murray for her leadership on the Budget Committee and for all her hard work in advancing a smart, balanced budget to meet our country's fiscal challenges. This is not the first time I've come to the Senate floor in the last year or in the last several years to stress the critical need for Democrats and Republicans to come together and focus on smart solutions to reducing our debt. I think it's a good sign that both the House and the Senate have passed budgets and that the President introduced his budget last month. I see this time as a real opportunity to come together to work through this budget process and get a deal done. We must take the next step in the process, which is to move forward under regular order and have the House and Senate conference on a budget deal. For years, we've been hearing from our colleagues across the aisle about how the Senate doesn't have the budget. Well, the Senate passed a budget, and all we want to do is to move this into conference committee so that the House and the Senate can work together so that we can get a budget for this country. There's growing bipartisan support for going to conference and starting the conversation so that we can come to an agreement on a long-term budget. Senators McCain and Collins last night came to the floor and talked about how we need to return to regular order in the Senate, and regular order means going to conference to come to a budget deal. Doing so will allow us to stop lurching from crisis to crisis and address our fiscal challenges in an open, bipartisan way. I believe this is what folks outside of Washington, especially the people I talk to in Minnesota, want, for us to put politics aside for the good of the country and come together on a budget deal that reduces our deficit in a balanced way, but also lays a foundation for sustained economic growth. In the past 2 years, Congress has made some progress in reducing the deficit. We've already achieved $2.4 trillion in deficit reduction, with a goal of $4 trillion reduction in 10 years within our grasp. Last week, the Congressional Budget Office reported that the deficit will fall to $642 billion this year, $200 billion less than what the CBO projected just 3 months ago. The better numbers reflect good news in housing and larger than expected increases in tax revenues. But I believe that resting on those numbers would be a mistake. And if we are to get closer to reaching a new deficit agreement, it's only going to happen if we work in a bipartisan way through regular order to get a deal done. Along with addressing our fiscal challenges, working through the budget process and coming to agreement will create a stronger, more resilient framework for economic renewal. We certainly see how we can get a major bill done through the Judiciary Committee last night when we were able to get the immigration bill done. There is no reason that a conference committee shouldn't be at work right now, taking the Senate budget that we've heard for years needs to be done and pairing it up with the House budget and coming together. In the bigger picture, this presents an opportunity for us to reinforce our role as a world leader in innovation, entrepreneurship, exporting, education. In other words, the things that we've always prided in this country. We want to be a nation that makes stuff again, that invents things, that exports to the world. And part of that is showing the world that we have our fiscal house in order. I believe the Senate proposal is the right blueprint for moving us forward. On the most immediate front, it will allow us to build on the progress we're already seeing in the economy. Last month, the national unemployment rate dropped to 7.5%. The lowest level in 4 years. Our housing market is turning around. Consumer spending has picked up in the first month of this year, as has private business investment. The unemployment rate in my state, the state of Minnesota, is at 5.4%. But even with this progress, our economy remains vulnerable to headwinds. Mr. President, we should keep this good economic momentum going, but only if we are willing to find common ground on a budget plan that also moves our economy forward. We need to take a balanced approach to deficit reduction, but you don't have to take my word for it. Nearly every commission that has offered ideas for reducing our debt has stressed the importance of balance. This includes the original Bowles-Simpson plan, the Rivlin-Domenici plan, and even the revised Bowles-Simpson plan, which calls for another $2.4 trillion in deficit reduction, a quarter of which would come from new revenues totaling $600 billion. We don't just need a balanced budget, Mr. President. We need a budget that is in balance. I believe the Senate's budget achieves that goal. It includes an equal mix of responsible spending cuts and new revenue from closing loopholes and ending wasteful spending in the tax code. Our budget builds on the $2.4 trillion in deficit reduction we've already achieved in the last 2 years, with an additional $975 billion in targeted cuts and $975 billion in new revenue, surpassing the bipartisan goal of $4 trillion. Just this morning, I was at the Joint Economic Committee. I'm the Senate chair of that committee, as were you, Mr. President, where Chairman Bernanke testified. And he warned us about the negative impact that with cuts that solely focus in the short term and what that would do with economic growth. He noted that policies like sequestration are creating headwinds against short-term economic growth, and that Congress needs to take a broader, long-term view toward our debt and deficit. That's what this conference committee is about. That's what regular order is about. We have a Senate budget, we have a House budget, and we have that opportunity to bring those budgets together in a conference committee. Some of the most important points in the Senate budget include the fact that it replaces sequestration with smart, targeted cuts while also making critical investments in areas like education, workforce training, and infrastructure. It produces savings in Medicare and Medicaid by eliminating waste and fraud, promoting efficiency, and emphasizing cost alignment. Our budget also recognizes that there is a massive amount of spending that takes place through the tax code, to the tune of over $1 trillion per year in tax expenditures. The Senate budget eliminates wasteful tax loopholes and subsidies. All told, the Senate budget cuts the deficit by approximately $2 trillion. This continues us on a downward path where our debt-to-GDP ratio will be about 70% by 2023. Getting the federal budget on a sustainable path will only promote growth and stability. The American people want us to get this done, Mr. President. They want us to compromise, and they want us to work together to get the economy on the right track. I urge my colleagues to support moving to conference so that we can begin the work of finding solutions to a very important matter. I want to speak briefly, if the chairwoman of the Agriculture Committee would mind, on one other topic, and that is the important economic issues for families and businesses in Minnesota, and that's the recent spike in gas prices. Now, we do have some good things in the Farm Bill that will help with this, including the promotion of energy and biofuels. But our talk today here to discuss the recent spike in gas prices in Minnesota, a problem that is disrupting commerce and hurting consumers, small businesses and farmers across the state and throughout our region. In Minnesota, the average gas price is $4.25, 40 cents higher than a week ago and over 80 cents more than only a month ago. It was, in fact, a few days ago, the highest in the country, higher than Honolulu, and it happened all of a sudden in literally a 2-week period. That's a significant increase which puts family budgets under severe pressure. I'm focused on immediate relief, and I'm taking actions now so we can avoid similar gas price spikes in the future. With Memorial Day around the corner, the start of the summer driving season is upon us, and this kind of price spike is simply outrageous. To cut back on costs, some families are already putting off family trips and scaling back vacations. I've already heard from families who canceled or scaled back their plans. But there are some things you can't put off, like driving to work, like going to the doctor's office. More money to fill up the tank means less money for food, housing, and everything else that families need. Families in Minnesota just can't afford an 80-cent spike in the price of a gallon of gas. Neither can business owners who need to ship their goods to market or farmers who rely on diesel fuel to keep their equipment running. Now, we know what's causing the price increase: supply shortages resulting from the simultaneous closure of several oil refineries in the Midwest. We also know what's not causing the price increase. The price of crude oil hasn't moved. We're at about $96 a barrel, similar to where prices were a month ago. In fact, the national trend in gas prices, which tracks the price of crude, hasn't moved much either. OPEC hasn't been jacking up their prices. We didn't have a hurricane or even a blizzard that would affect supply or prices, and the increase hasn't been caused by a pipeline rupture or geopolitical threat. Rather, the price spike has resulted largely from the combination of a number of refineries going offline for scheduled and unscheduled maintenance that serve the upper Midwest to prepare for summer fuel blends. I understand that refiners need to adjust their plants and occasionally perform upgrades to protect worker safety and repair equipment. But scheduled routine maintenance should not be an excuse for major gasoline shortages and price spikes. 3 refineries, Mr. President, in Indiana, Illinois, and Flint Hills, Minnesota, currently shut down for maintenance or upgrades. A 4th in Wisconsin is currently offline as they turn their production over to summer fuel blends. And a 5th refinery in St. Paul Park, Minnesota, remained down longer than expected. But I understand that that refinery is again operational. The result of all these closures: Minnesota and other parts of the upper Midwest simply don't have enough refined gasoline to make it to the market right now. In this day and age, when we have a surplus of fuel, when we're drilling record amounts in North Dakota, when we don't see a huge increase in the price of oil, this just shouldn't be happening. That's why last Thursday I called on the Department of Energy to thoroughly review the timing of scheduled maintenance operations and to take action to address future supply problems that are preventable. I've also spoken with the Department of Energy about ways to resolve the issue quickly and prevent disruptions down the road. I'm working with DOE and industry partners on legislation that addresses known scheduled closures for refineries for maintenance. Having improved information could serve as an early warning system to protect consumers from production problems within the refinery industry. With more transparency transparency and more lead time, fuel retailers will have the opportunity to purchase fuel at prices that better reflect the underlying cost of crude oil and better reflect supply and demand across the country. I also believe that refineries should give immediate notification of any unplanned outages, and I'm working to address this as well. I'm also working with the Secretary of Energy to look at the potential for additional refined fuel storage capacity in our region. Minnesota has less storage capacity for refined products than other parts of the country, making us more vulnerable to the kinds of refinery outages we've experienced this year, both planned and unplanned. If we had additional storage in place, we could better ensure fair and consistent prices for our consumers. This week, I talked to all the major oil companies that own these refineries, and it looks as though additional shipments from a pipeline are helping to increase supplies. This should provide some relief. Petroleum marketers in Minnesota have reported that spot prices in the wholesale market were down by 30 cents, but that drop has not yet reached our consumers, Mr. President. I believe that we need an all-or-above plan to get serious about building a new energy agenda for America. This, of course, means less dependence on foreign oil, more domestic production of oil like we're seeing in North Dakota, natural gas, and, of course, biofuels. It also means tougher vehicle efficiency standards that help cars to go further on a tank of gas. But my focus today, Mr. President, is on our immediate problem. We need to get refineries up and running and get gas prices down so that we can all begin to enjoy this summer. I look forward to continuing to work with the Department of Energy and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address the recent and unnecessary spike in gas prices and to prevent this from happening again. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of Senator Shaheen, I would like to call up for Amendment 925.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Michigan, Mrs. Stabenow, for Mrs. Shaheen and others, proposes an amendment numbered 925. In Title I,
I would ask that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And just for the information of the members who are working to set up a vote later this afternoon on this particular amendment, I'm working with Senator Cochran and Republican colleagues in order to set up that vote. Thank you.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the Senate floor to discuss a very important topic and one that itself is coming to the Senate floor soon, and that's the problem of illegal immigration and proposals for so-called comprehensive immigration reform. Specifically, of course, the Gang of Eight bill, as it's been dubbed, is being reported out of the Judiciary Committee, and we'll be debating that bill and hopefully a lot of important amendments to it soon in June here on the Senate floor. Now, Mr. President, let me say at the outset, I think there are at least a couple of things we can all agree about. Number one, I think we can all agree that the United States is an immigrant nation with a proud history of immigration, legal immigration, and it's absolutely one of the core features of our nation that makes us unique and that makes us strong. And so I want to say that up front very proudly, very strongly. I support that tradition, that history of our being an immigrant nation. Every one of us, you know, are the children of immigrants. Not a question of if, it's just a question of when, because that's the nature of America, and that goes to the core of our strength. Number two, Mr. President, the other thing I think we can all agree about is that our present immigration system is broken. In fact, it's badly, badly broken, and we need to fix the system. Now, as I said a minute ago, we have a proud history of immigration, legal immigration, And that's the tradition, that's the history we need to get back to. Unfortunately, right now we have a system of wide open illegal immigration, almost open borders in some cases in some areas, and that desperately needs to be fixed. Now, having said that, Mr. President, I have real and fundamental concerns with the so-called Gang of Eight bill, and they fall into 5 or 6 big categories, and I want to talk about each of those important categories in turn. First and foremost, Mr. President, really my biggest and my most fundamental concern, I think this so-called Gang of Eight bill repeats mistakes of the past because at its core, it's amnesty now and enforcement later, and maybe never. We've tried that model before. We've tried it several times before, and it's never worked. The most clear example is the 1986 immigration overhaul. That bill, at its core, was the same model, amnesty now and enforcement later, and maybe never. And in fact, much of that enforcement was never. And that's why it didn't work. The amnesty kicked in immediately, the millisecond the bill was signed into law. And that was a powerful message to invite more and more illegal crossings across the border, more illegal immigrants into our country. That part of the bill, that part of the message was heard loud and clear. The promises of enforcement never fully materialized. Many of them never materialized at all. And so what happened when you had that combination of an immediate amnesty with promises of enforcement that never materialized? Well, again, you attracted more illegal crossings. You had no capability or will to do anything about them. And so, Mr. President, the promise then was we're just going to have to do this once. The system will be fixed. We'll never have to look back. We'll never have to look in the rearview mirror. The problem will be solved. And what happened? Well, we all know the problem wasn't solved. In fact, the problem wasn't simply continued. The problem was quadrupled. What was 3 million illegal immigrants then, they were mostly made legal. But that number, 3 million, quadrupled, and now today we have 11, 12 million illegal immigrants, some think more. That, at its core, is the Gang of Eight bill, an immediate amnesty, promises of enforcement, and that's not good enough, particularly when we have decades of the federal government, Republicans and Democrats, who have promised this before and have never delivered. The American people say, we'll trust, but we want to verify. Trust but verify. We need to see this enforcement in action before we move on to anything else. In fact, in some ways, this Gang of Eight bill is worse in terms of that basic model than previous versions like 1986. Because if you look at page 70 of the bill, it actually has a period of an enforcement holiday. So 2.5 years of a pure enforcement holiday. So not only is that this amnesty now and enforcement later, maybe never, applied to folks who are in the country illegally now, but they can keep coming. The message will be sent out, and they can come the day after the bill passes, the week after the bill passes, the year after the bill passes, 2 years after the bill passes, and it's part of the same amnesty. They will get the benefits of that amnesty as well. That enforcement holiday, 2.5 years, makes that combination of a big amnesty now with only promises of enforcement later even more potentially disastrous. Mr. President, the second big problem I have with the bill as it's currently put together is it doesn't enforce the law, and it doesn't enforce the border, particularly the troublesome southern border with Mexico, and it doesn't enforce other enforcement provisions, doesn't actually guarantee that those are put into place and executed in an effective way. the proponents of the bill talk about so-called triggers in the bill before the amnesty, before the new legal status is granted. But when you look hard at what the triggers are, they're triggers on a toy plastic gun, not real triggers in any meaningful sense of the term. The triggers basically narrow down to two things. First of all, the Secretary has to submit two reports, two plans. The Secretary of Homeland Security has to submit plans or reports, a so-called, quote, comprehensive southern border security strategy. So she has to submit a strategy. Great. This was promised for 3 decades, but now she has to submit a strategy, a piece of paper, and a, quote, southern border fencing strategy, close quote. So that's one trigger. The other triggers are certification that the border security strategy is, quote, substantially deployed and substantially operational, close quote. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, two things. Who the heck knows what substantially deployed means? And number two, even more troublesome, you know who has to certify that? The Secretary of Homeland Security, who has not been effective at enforcement to date in any way, shape, or form. So those so-called triggers are absolutely meaningless. The bill doesn't require a fence, as is actually required under present law, so we're weakening that. We're walking away with that. It weakens current law regarding border security. Operational control is the standard now, and that's being weakened, changed to effective control. And it doesn't require a biometric data system for entry and exit screening. That has been pushed by Congress since 1996. Congress started mandating this in 1996, and it was one of the prime recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, full deployment of the U.S. visit system. The 9/11 Commission said that needs to be a high priority. That's exactly how the 9/11 terrorists got into our country and overstayed their visas. Doesn't do any of that. So, again, enforcement holiday for 2.5 years and no border security now before the amnesty kicks in. Number three, I'm very concerned that we will continue the present status quo, which is significant benefits being available to these immigrants, which act as a magnet to incent other illegal immigrants to come into the country. Now, the so-called Gang of Eight makes all sorts of promises about certain benefits not kicking in until full citizenship is granted down the road. But many benefits would kick in immediately, certainly participation in the Social Security system, certainly all those Social Security benefits, and there are loopholes about these benefits. I think many illegal immigrants will clearly gain access to public benefits far sooner than any 13 years as advertised. So that is another serious weakness of the bill. Fourth, Mr. President, I'm very concerned about the cost of this bill. Now, the authors of this bill have been very, very clever. They saw that cost issue coming, and they devised the bill so that the big costs of the bill are outside the 10-year budget window. Now, why is that important? Well, not to get into the weeds, but it's very important because CBO scores legislation primarily on its impact on taxes and spending in the first 10 years. And so the authors of the bill were very careful, very clever in devising a bill that would look okay in the first 10 years with regard to cost. But after that first 10-year window, the costs explode, and none of that will be reflected by the CBO score. We've seen this movie before, Mr. President, because this is exactly the same approach to CBO scoring and costs of legislation, exactly the same approach that the proponents of Obamacare put forward. They were very, very clever to push many of the costs in the out years beyond the first initial scoring window. and that's why they were able to wave CBO scores around to somehow suggest this would help lessen the deficit. It's perfectly clear now, Mr. President, Obamacare is not going to make our fiscal situation better. It's going to make it far, far worse and far more onerous. I believe exactly the same thing is true with this bill in terms of the cost, and I believe the proponents of the bill, quite frankly, have gamed the system in the same way to hide those costs, given the way CBO scores legislation. Now, in contrast to that, there is an objective study of the full costs of the bill, and that is a study by Robert Rector of the Heritage Foundation. And he went into extreme detail tracking the full costs and fiscal benefits of the bill. And his conclusion was that the full costs of the bill are $6.3 trillion over the full life and the full impact of the bill. $6.3 trillion with a T. He concluded that the bill, because of all the folks that would legalize, would kick in $9.4 trillion in government benefits. So more government benefits we're going to have to pay out, $9.4 trillion. Now, these folks being legalized would pay some taxes into the system, which they do not pay now, and that would be $3.1 trillion. But when you subtract 3.1 from 9.4, that obviously doesn't net out to zero. That's a net increase in the deficit, increased cost to the government, to society, to the taxpayer of $6.3 trillion net. That's a serious impact on these budget and fiscal issues we're already very, very concerned about. The Robert Rector study is very credible. It's very detailed. I've seen no comparable study in terms of the detail of the analysis. And I would challenge anyone who cares about this issue, wherever they're coming from, to put up any other study that can compete with the Rector study in terms of detail and analysis. I think currently that is the last and final word on costs of the bill. Two final points, Mr. President. Fifth big concern I have about the bill is I believe this bill is very unfair to legal immigrants and folks who are waiting in line in the legal immigration system now. It puts some people, not everybody who would be made legal, but some people ahead of them in line, and really dishonors the fact that these would-be legal immigrants are following the rules now and following the law now. And sixth and finally, and this is no trivial matter, I'm very concerned that this would depress wages in the United States for many, many hard-working Americans, legal immigrants, others who have followed the law, who are working hard in a very, very tough economy now. I think it would depress the general wage situation and make that more difficult for them to deal with. So in closing, Mr. President, I urge all of my colleagues to look carefully at these and other concerns and try to address them fully, directly, completely on the Senate floor. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we continue debate on the Agricultural Reform, Food and Jobs Act, I want to remind my colleagues how important this bill is for our economy and for the 16 million people whose jobs rely on agriculture. When we go home at night and sit down at the dinner table, it's because those 16 million people have worked hard to make sure that we had safe, affordable food on our table. They are the men and women who farm the land. They are also the people who manufacture and sell the farm equipment, the people who ship the crops from one place to another, the people who own the farmers markets and the local food hubs, the people who work in processing and crop fertility, not to mention the researchers and the scientists who work hard every day to fight pests and diseases that threaten our food supply. I want to talk specifically for a few moments about the work we're doing in the conservation title of the Farm Bill. Our Farm Bill improves 1.9 million acres for fish and wildlife habitat. And this is about jobs as well. Healthy wildlife habitats, clean fishable waters are not only good for our environment, but they also support hunting and fishing and all of our other outdoor recreation that benefits our economy and creates jobs. In fact, outdoor recreation supports over 6 million jobs in our United States. And in this Farm Bill, we are including a new historic agreement around conservation, the most powerful conservation work in decades. It's truly amazing that what can happen when people actually sit down, Mr. President, and listen to one another and work together. If farmers want to participate in Title I commodity programs, including the current direct payments subsidy program, they must take steps to use best conservation practices on their land when it comes to highly erodible soil and wetlands. This has been the case for many years. Of course, the Agricultural Reform, Food and Jobs Act that we're debating now eliminates those subsidies. Instead, we're strengthening crop insurance, which farmers need to purchase, and we're making market-oriented reforms to the commodity programs. But here's the issue. If we eliminate direct payment subsidies, we don't want to create unintended consequences by not having that link any longer. It's important for all of us that sensitive lands be managed in the best possible way. That's how we avoided having a dust bowl during the droughts. It's important for us to continue protecting wetlands, which help prevent flooding and are important to wildlife habitats for ducks and other waterfowl. Now, commodity groups and conservation groups were on different sides of this issue for a long time. But they looked at the issue from vastly different viewpoints. They didn't agree on the best approach, and they could have followed a very typical Washington playbook, Mr. President. They could have gone to their corners, fired off emails and press releases and brought the lobbyists on and demonized each other, but that's not what happened. Like farmers and families across the country, they sat down together around a table and they did something we don't do enough. They listened to each other. They listened and tried to see the other viewpoint, and they came to understand one another, and turned out their differences weren't so great after all. And with a little compromise and a lot of hard work, they were able to come together with a plan that conserves soil and water resources for generations to come, and it protects the safety net our farmers rely on. This has been called the greatest advancement in conservation in 3 decades. I want to underscore for my colleagues, this is an important historic agreement, and others deserve credit as much as I certainly would like to take credit for this, or Senator Cochran would, and we certainly are very supportive and encouraging this. This came from a group of people working together. I know a number of my colleagues today are planning to talk about amendments. Some have already been on the floor talking about amendments on crop insurance. And I know a number of colleagues voted for some of the amendments last time around. But this conservation agreement puts us in a very different situation this year. For one thing, we want to make sure the biggest landowners who control the most acres are using crop insurance. Crop insurance is voluntary. You know, prior to crop insurance, there were subsidies and then ad hoc disaster assistance. Now we're encouraging them to purchase crop insurance, and we want them to have it, which means now they would need to use conservation practices to preserve sensitive lands and wetlands on those largest tracts, as well as small tracts. Amendments that weaken crop insurance would reduce the number of farmers participating in crop insurance, raising premiums for family farmers, and reducing the environmental impacts and the environmental benefits of this historic conservation agreement. With the new agreement, the math is very simple. The more acres that's in crop insurance, the more we have environmental and conservation benefits. Now, my dear friend from Illinois came to the floor a while ago and said that the majority of crop insurance was in a small number of farmers. Well, it's true. The larger the farm, the more you use crop insurance. It's just like saying anybody who buys an insurance, a bigger home has more insurance than the smaller home. The bigger business, manufacturers, probably buy the biggest part of insurance rather than small businesses. I'm not sure what the point is of that. Of course, we have large farmers buying more crop insurance than small farmers. What we want to make sure of is that there are the environmental and conservation benefits on those large farms, just like on smaller farms. There's another reason my colleagues should reevaluate these amendments, and I would encourage, as they come before us, that we vote no. This chart shows the counties that were declared disaster areas last year. An awful lot of red, Mr. President. 2012 was one of the worst droughts on record ever in the United States. And in the past, in situations like this, we would have passed ad hoc disaster assistance for the corn growers and the wheat growers and the soybean growers and the other crop farmers. But we didn't have to do that because crop insurance works. Crop insurance, which is not a subsidy. When you have crop insurance, you get a bill, Mr. President, a bill to pay. Now, we share in that cost to make sure there's a discount so they can afford the bill, but they get a bill. They don't get a check. And the only farmers last year who needed disaster assistance were the ones who can't participate in crop insurance, which we fix in this farm bill. We address permanent livestock disaster assistance. They don't have access to the same crop insurance. We address farmers like mine, my cherry growers, who are wiped out when it got warm in the spring and then froze again and completely wiped out the cherries. They don't have crop insurance now. They need some extra help, but we are in this farm bill giving them access to crop insurance, which is the primary risk management tool for farmers. Producers purchase crop insurance so they are protected when there is a disaster. But if we weaken crop insurance, resulting in premium hikes of as much as 40% on small farmers, we're going to be going back to the days of ad hoc disaster assistance, something we cannot afford in today's tight budget climate. Finally, we need to keep this historic agreement in place through the conference committee. We owe it to the folks who sat down and worked out this agreement, and I would ask colleagues to stand with the 36 or 34 different organizations that came together. And I would ask for the record that I be able to submit, along with my testimony today, the number of groups in the coalition that put this together.
Without objection.
We need to make sure that our colleagues in the House, as well as here in the Senate, stand with all of these groups who've worked hard to compromise and forge this very historic, constructive agreement. If we want to preserve conservation wins that we have in the Farm Bill, we need to support the farmers, the environmentalists, the conservationists who've made it very clear that this agreement is something they stand behind. We should not be weakening crop insurance or making it harder for large producers who have the majority of land we want to conserve to have less of an incentive to participate in the program. Mr. President, let me just say, and I know my colleague from Vermont is here to speak as well, but I want to thank again the 34 organizations, everyone from the American Farm Bureau and the Soybean Association, the Audubon Society, Ducks Unlimited, Environmental Defense Fund, National Wildlife Federation, National Cotton Council, right on down the line, National Farmers Union, Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, U.S. Rice Federation. This is an incredible coalition, and it speaks very loudly both to the fact that we need to keep in place the #1 risk management tool for our growers, but we need to make sure that they are providing the conservation practices to protect our soil and our water that are so critical for the future for our children and grandchildren. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President. Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, let me begin by congratulating Senators Stabenow and Cochran for their hard work on this very important piece of legislation, especially for rural states like Vermont, but I guess everybody who eats, which is, I guess, the majority of the people in our country. Mr. President, I want to spend a few minutes talking about some important amendments that I am offering. I think one of them, the amendment I'll talk about first, will be coming up for a vote either later tonight or tomorrow, and that deals with the right of states to label genetically engineered food. And that is amendment number 965. Mr. President, this year the Vermont State House of Representatives passed a bill by a vote of 99 to 42, requiring that genetically engineered food be labeled. I can tell you with absolute certainty that the people of Vermont want to know what is in their food and are extremely supportive of what the state legislature has done. But this is an issue certainly not just limited to Vermont. Yesterday, as I understand it, the Connecticut State Senate, by an overwhelming vote of 35 to 1, also passed legislation to require labeling of genetically engineered food. In California, our largest state, where the issue was on the ballot last November, 47% of the people there voted for labeling, despite the biotech industry spending over $47 million in a campaign in opposition to that proposition. That's an enormous sum of money, and yet 47% of the people voted for labeling of GMOs. In the state of Washington, some 350,000 people signed a petition in support of Initiative 522 to label genetically engineered foods in that state. In fact, according to a recent poll done earlier this year, approximately 82% of the American people believe that labeling should take place with regard to genetically engineered ingredients. All over this country, increasingly, people are concerned about the quality of the food they are ingesting and the food that they are giving to their kids. People want to know what is in their food, and I believe that is a very reasonable request. Mr. President, what I am proposing today, the amendment I am offering, is certainly not a radical concept. In fact, the requirement of labeling genetically modified food exists today in dozens and dozens of countries throughout the world, including our closest allies in the European Union, including Russia, Australia, South Korea, Japan, Brazil, China, New Zealand, and other countries. So this is not some kind of new and crazy idea. In fact, it exists all over the world. At a time when many of my colleagues expressed their strong conviction about states' rights and that states should be allowed to have increased responsibilities, this amendment should be supported by those people who, in fact, believe in states' rights. And the reason for that is that when the state of Vermont and other states go forward in passing legislation to label genetically modified food, they have been threatened by Monsanto and other large biotech companies with costly lawsuits. So states are going forward doing what they think is proper for their own people, and then you have Monsanto and other very large biotech companies coming forward and saying, we're going to sue you. And what are the grounds? The major grounds for that lawsuit is that Monsanto is arguing, what I believe is absolutely incorrect, but they are arguing that states do not have the right to pass legislation like this, that it is, in fact, a federal prerogative and not something that a state can legally do. I believe very strongly that Monsanto is wrong, but that is precisely what this amendment clarifies. Today, we have an opportunity with this amendment to affirm once and for all that states do have the right to label food that contains genetically engineered ingredients. Let me just very briefly tell you what's in the amendment. This amendment finds that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States clearly reserves powers in the system of federalism to the states or to the people. This amendment finds that states have the authority to require the labeling of foods produced through genetically engineering or derived from organisms that have been genetically engineered. Furthermore, this amendment requires that 1 year after the enactment of this act, the Commissioner of the FDA and the Secretary of Agriculture shall undertake the necessary regulations to carry out this amendment. Mr. President, there is strong precedent for labeling GMOs. The FDA already requires the labeling of over 3,000 ingredients and additives. If you want to know if your food contains gluten, aspartame, high fructose corn syrup, trans fats, or MSG, you simply read the ingredient label. Millions and millions of people every day look at labels. How many calories are there in the food? What are the ingredients in the food? This simply does what we have been doing as a nation for many, many years. Only right now, Americans are not afforded the same right for GE foods. Mr. President, Monsanto and other companies claim that there is nothing to be concerned about with genetically engineered food. But yet, FDA scientists and doctors have warned us that GE foods could have new and different risks, such as hidden allergens, increased plant toxin levels, and the potential to hasten the spread of antibiotic-resistant disease. So, Mr. President, this is a pretty simple amendment. It basically says that the American people have a right to know what they are eating. This is a legislation I know that the people of Vermont, I gather the people of Connecticut, and I think people all over this country would like to see passed, and I would ask for its support. Mr. President, there are a couple of other amendments that I would like to briefly discuss having to do with the SNAP program. And one of them deals with the need for seniors to be better able to access the SNAP program. It is no secret that in our country today, millions and millions of seniors are struggling to get by on limited income. And the result of that is that after they pay their prescription drug costs or their rent or their utilities, they do not have enough money to spend on food. And it is estimated today that some 1 million seniors are going hungry in the United States of America. That is something that we should be embarrassed about and an issue that we should address as soon as possible. Clearly, the toll that inadequate nutrition has for seniors impacts their overall health, and my strong guess is that this amendment will end up saving us money, because when seniors get good nutrition, they're less likely to fall, break their hips, end up in the emergency room, end up in the hospital. So I think from a moral perspective, from a cost perspective, we want to see and make sure that all seniors in this country, regardless of their income, have the nutrition that they need. SNAP plays a crucial role in our country in reducing hunger. In 2011, SNAP raised nearly 5 million people out of poverty. But here's the main point that I want to make. Only 35% of eligible individuals over age 60 participated in SNAP in 2010. In other words, there are many, many seniors out there who could benefit from SNAP, but for a variety of reasons, one of which I'm addressing right now, they do not participate. Mr. President, as you may well know, the SNAP application process can be confusing and cumbersome for many households, especially for seniors. Individuals apply for SNAP either by visiting an application center which is a challenge for people with mobility issues. If you are not able to get out of your home, if you can't afford transportation, getting to that center can be very, very difficult. It is also challenging when dealing with an application over the telephone if you are hard of hearing, which clearly many seniors are. At the same time, the complicated interview process costs local, state, tribal, and federal governments additional administrative dollars. The SNAP amendment that I am offering here is pretty simple. It will help alleviate hunger by allowing seniors to more easily apply for and access SNAP benefits. In order to reduce barriers for seniors applying to SNAP, this amendment proposes to do the following. It allows states to deputize, which in this case means to certify, nonprofit organizations and area agencies on aging that are meeting with seniors directly and helping them with their SNAP application to conduct the interview on the state's behalf. The state agency would still determine eligibility. Further, states would have the flexibility to deputize only the agencies that have the capacity to fulfill the state's interview requirements on their behalf. This amendment does not waive any documentation requirements or ease any other requirements. Eligibility for the benefits must still be verified. What it does do is reduce duplication of efforts and ease the burden on vulnerable families and seniors for whom it is a challenge to travel to a state office or wait for days at a friend's house who has a phone to make a call. So in other words, all that this is doing is saying if we want to make sure that seniors stay healthy, get the nutrition they need, stay out of the emergency room, stay out of the hospital, let us make it easier for them to take advantage of the programs that are currently available. And in this case, the SNAP program eligibility process for seniors is pretty complicated, and sometimes people who want to be in the program simply are unable to do that. So I would hope that we could have support for that amendment. And the other SNAP amendment deals with an equally important issue of people who are wrongfully dropped from the program, often due to an administrative error. The current system is inefficient. We are spending government money that should be going to help people buy food, and instead we're spending it on paperwork and bureaucracy. The improvements that I am proposing will help alleviate hunger, as fewer people will go without the benefits they need, and state and federal administrative resources will be used more effectively. My amendment requires the USDA to track information from states on the problem of quote-unquote churn, and that's the term used when eligible people are dropped from the program and then must reapply. The USDA and advocacy groups have identified churn as a key problem in the administration of SNAP benefits. Having people reapply who never should have been dropped from the benefit in the first place adds to the caseload burden. Tracking the information is only a first step. Then we must find solutions to reduce the problem so that people don't lose their benefits, whether that be improved training, clearer forms and notices, or simpler recertification processes. These improvements will reduce hunger by making sure that people get the benefits for which they are eligible and so desperately need. Mr. President, the last issue that I briefly want to touch on deals with the need for the USDA to help us understand through a study the impact that global warming is having on agriculture. We all know that we are looking at record-setting droughts in Australia, Brazil, and locations in America, record-setting droughts. U.S. cities matched or broke at least 29,000 high-temperature records last year. Ice-free Arctic summers will be with us within a couple of years, and that is the reality of the moment. The impacts of global warming clearly will be felt far and wide, but farmers across the country are among those who will suffer the most. Warmer temperatures, water shortages, and droughts, and other extreme weather disturbances will force producers to alter practices, change crops, and spend more money to sustain their operations. So what this amendment simply does is that it asks the USDA to do a study to provide us with a better understanding of how our changing climate will impact agriculture across the country and help farmers plan and adapt to those changes. It will help local communities and states make critical adjustments now, and it will reduce the vulnerability of the entire agricultural sector to the damaging consequences of climate change. So we think this is an important amendment. States, farmers need to have the information about what scientists believe will be happening to the work that they're doing in years to come. And I would ask for support of that amendment. Last, very briefly, we in the past have successfully offered an amendment on community gardens in Vermont now. Schools, communities are working on gardens all over the state. We had a national program passed last year as well. This would simply expand that program to allow schools and communities to engage with limited help from the federal government in community gardens. Teach kids about the foods that they are eating and about agriculture. Very inexpensive concept which has been working very successfully and I think needs to be expanded. So with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I rise today to offer my support for the sugar reform amendment being offered on the Farm Bill by Senator Shaheen. This important amendment would begin a reform process that deals with a complicated and burdensome program and artificially raises